Hey, what's up, guys? It's Bales. I'm here to do a lineup review of a few of my lineups and a couple others from last night's MLB action. Doing it because I had a big cash, and that's always a little bit more fun to look at the lineup. And the real reason, the bigger reason, is a FantasyLabs user, Griffith, tweeted us. He won the home run on DraftKings, 100K to first. So that's a huge cash, and he had an awesome lineup. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that one first. He went with Severino and Triggs, which is a really interesting pitcher combo, just because they left so much salary on the table. Severino cheap, Triggs only 5K. So once you do that, it was pretty difficult to even stack the top offenses, because you just couldn't fit enough high-priced bats in to come close to filling the cap. It was very difficult. So you can see here that LUKWARM actually didn't really stack in this. He had 3 Cubs, but that was it. It looked pretty close to an optimal. And if you go to my model from last night, you can change the date up here, by the way. Whenever you're looking at miles, so you can go back and look at ratings from prior days. It goes back a couple years, and you can also generate lineups, so you can use the MultiLineup Builder and build on past dates, and then see the actual points that the players actually scored and that the lineups would have scored. So it's a really useful tool that I think is maybe underutilized to back test some things you're doing when you build a new model. Go in and you can immediately see what kind of lineups it would have generated. So in this model, you had Severino at the top, Triggs number 3, and if you lock those 2 guys in, you get an optimize. You get a lineup that's pretty close to what LUKWARM had, with at least 4 players the same. You can see all those high-priced bats. So there are definitely times when it can make sense to not stack or to not fully stack. This was a really big slate where I was stacking because I didn't envision incredibly high ownership really on anyone. You can see, obviously, Triggs was a contrarian pitcher. I thought he might be a little higher than 3% just because he was so cheap. And if you look back at him, I wasn't exactly sure how much exposure to have to him, because I did like him quite a bit. The Rangers projected at just 3.8 runs. Obviously, he's in a good park. I think one of the top 3 or so last night for pitchers. Bargain rating 99%, which means if you were going to play him, you definitely probably wanted to do that on DraftKings. He was just much cheaper there because of their pricing floor on those cheap pitchers. And he had a K prediction, which I'm using quite a bit this year, of 6.6, which isn't too bad. You can see 5th highest. Good ump, a positive ump, Mike Everett for pitchers. So there were a lot of reasons to like him. I had, I believe, 50% exposure to him as well on DK, which we'll take a look at. So once you locked in those guys, it was difficult to stack. But once he did that, the ownership percentages of individual players, I think, become a little less relevant because you don't have the same overlap that other lineups do. So if you're not going to stack, you can, in my opinion, just use chalk batters, really, especially if you're going low at pitching, so Harper and Chris Bryant, and get those big bats in. And the ownership, you can see 27% on Harper and some pretty big numbers. Not nearly as important as it might be if he went with a 1 through 5 stack and there were 200 lineups or 300 lineups that had the exact same stack in there. It really is important to analyze ownership within the context of the overall lineup and not just on the player. A player's individual ownership means something different within the context of a whole lineup. So I thought he did a really good job here, naturally contrarian at the pitchers, not stacking, worked out for him here. So congrats to LUKWARM, and that's an awesome score. My lineup on FanDuel, again, finished 3rd, a couple points out of 2nd. This was actually, I had better lineups overall on DK, so you can see I believe they were both 444 entries. I had 5 on FanDuel and cashed 2, but there was just a very wide range of scores, and you can see the one that got third was far higher than anything else, so got a little bit lucky probably to have this combo. Definitely very lucky, actually. And on DK had better lineups, cashed 5 of 6, I believe, but nothing too high. 34th got, I don't even know, 34th was 3K, so that mostly paid for the buy-ins for this there. But yeah, on FanDuel I had Severino, because I had, so the pitchers I used last night were Severino. We'll go to a model that I used. We'll go to last night for pitchers, but I used Scherzer, Severino, Triggs. You can see the guys who are pretty hard. A little Darvish and Ryu, and that was it across the sites. You can see all of those guys. There's pretty much the top 5 there. And actually, you might be able to see. Okay, so there's my exposure. This was on DraftKings, and had a little bit different exposure on FanDuel, but those guys were also all very high in K prediction. So those were the pitchers that I rolled out, and then I used I believe even more Severino on FanDuel. I believe a little bit better price there, although it was close. And in both of my top lineups, I used an Indian stack. This was one that I thought would be higher owned, but I wasn't afraid of the ownership too much because of the huge slate, every team playing, and you're just, unless there's a game at Coors and the Rockies are at 6.5 runs or 7 runs or whatever, you're not going to see ridiculous ownership on anyone probably. So just don't care as much, and don't care as much on FanDuel, because you can't really get the same lineup overlap that you can on DK because of pricing and because of the stacking. So in both of these I used, or actually on DK I used Triggs and Scherzer. Here I used Severino. One thing that I've been doing that I didn't do in either of these 2 top lineups is using a pitcher in a stack. That's more difficult on FanDuel because you can only stack 4 and the pitcher counts for that, so you can only use a 3-man stack in a pitcher. So it's a little bit difficult to do it on FanDuel and get the same effect. But on DK, especially, have been going with a pitcher and their team as the stack. But obviously only if I like both of those in isolation, and there weren't as many situations like that last night. But you can see Indian stack here. The teams that I had the most exposure to were the Indians by far. We can go ahead and look at their team ratings in here, but there were a few guys who just really stood out. Lindor and a few other guys we can look at. Indians here, they were projected at 4.7 runs, really high ratings across the board. We had pretty minimal ownership projections on everyone except for Lindor, who I believe was by far the highest. So that was a good spot. Also, interesting thing to look at with the Indians is Encarnacion and Santana. You can now get Santana in there, but the position eligibility, and if you're, say, stacking a different team and then using one of these guys you're forced to use one at first base. It just creates a situation where people need to choose, and it's a way to be unique. There's a few teams across the league where players play the same position or position eligible at the same spot, and you either have a situation like this or sometimes you can only use one. And in that spot, I really like, especially on chalk stacks, ones I think are going to be really high owned, I really like to just go with a 1 through 4 stack and then skip the 5 batter, or whoever I think is going to be the highest owned, and use the other guy. And that's a way to really you pass almost all of the stacks with that team if one thing happens, and that one thing is basically just that the lower owned guy at that position outscores his teammate. So that was mostly my thinking last night. I went with a mini Cubs 3-man here. Zobrist, obviously the only batter who didn't do very well, but I believe that wouldn't have really affected this lineup too much. I think the guy in second had Zobrist as well. And then also, last thing, congratulations to Mirage88, 8888 on FanDuel. He's a friend of mine, AJ, and I think one of the most underrated DFS players. He's just really, really sharp. He was in one of my books from a few years ago, helped out with that, and just could tell immediately how smart of a guy he is. And he's a big game theory guy, and just is really, you can see this is a pretty unique lineup. He a lot of times will, I think he goes back of the order probably a little bit more than some other guys, and I think he might be contrarian at pitcher a little bit more. So he used Fulmer, who is a guy that wasn't on my radar that had a huge game. So congrats to him on winning the 100K on FanDuel. So that's about it. Definitely take home point from this is to make sure you're going back and back testing and spending, I don't know, at least 20 or 30% of your research time not looking at the future slate and looking at past ones and generating lineups and fine-tuning the models that you build here at FantasyLabs.